Okay, let's start checking the sound. Doing some sound checks. Sound checks before we get started. Doing some sound checks. This is the awkward time where you guys get to watch me get set up before we start. Doing some sound checks. This is the awkward time where you guys get to watch me get set up before we start. Looks like we're doing good. So far, so good. Doing some sound checks. Oh, this is where I get the infinity loop where I'm watching myself. And it just keeps playing back. Set up before we start. Looks like we're doing good. So far, so good. Doing some sound checks. Oh, this is where I get the infinity loop where I'm watching myself. And it just keeps playing back. Set up before we start. Looks like we're doing good. So far, so good. All right, that's enough infinity loop for now. Looks like we're good. Okay, well, I'm just going to give it a few minutes as per usual, since we usually start, I think this one usually starts around 4. So we'll wait for the chat to kind of start populating and getting set up. I'm going to write a little message in there for you guys. So I'm going to start the discussion about some of the questions that I'm going to be answering. So I'm going to say, forum. Is tab number 9. I commented on my own thing. How about that? Maybe I'm just lame. Well, we already knew that. Okay, I'm going to pull my questions up so we have that good to go. That looks good. Still looks good. Cool. I think we are mostly good to go. One more check on the audio here. One more check on the audio here. Yep, audio's good. All right, so we're just going to give it maybe like 2 more minutes or so just for some more people to show up and populate and ask questions. So I'm just going to sit tight and you guys get to awkwardly watch me for a few minutes or two, and then we'll get rocking and rolling. So I'm going to start with forum questions today, and then, of course, if you guys pop in some live Q&A, be happy to answer those, or I can just rant about, who knows, whatever I want to rant about, which is usually things like anime, sci-fi, all sorts of crazy stuff. So we'll just sit tight for a minute or two, and then we'll get rocking. I'm going to try not to be awkward as much as possible, but for those of you who know me, it's pretty rough. I'm going to check my phone. All right, great. We already got some questions coming. All right, RP Plus, welcome back. I know you guys are used to having Nick Shaw around this time. Unfortunately, you're stuck with me, James Hoffman, again. Right? You had enough of me on Tuesday, and you're hoping to see a fresh, handsome face. Instead, you're stuck with me. So Nick was a little busy today. I believe he is moving, so let's wish him the best of luck in his move. And I'm filling in, so I'm here to answer forum questions and, of course, live Q&A as always. So I pulled questions from the forum, and I apologize if you posted them within the last hour or so. I might not have gotten them. I grabbed questions from this morning as I was kind of getting prepped and doing some of my work for today. So if you guys want to follow along with some of the questions, I pulled them from the last page on the forum. So I'm going to read them out, but just in case you want to, follow along, please check out the forum, the Ask Dr. Mike and James one under the MISC tab. And I believe it should be from the last page, which I think is up to like tab number 9 or so. So let's get right to it, folks. I got some questions ready to go. So Steve Blair asked, deloads always isocaloric regardless of bulking or cutting? I was planning for 5 weeks of weight loss, but if it's important for the deload to be at maintenance, I might have to try and increase the length of meso to 6 weeks. So deloads, this is a question we get a lot. Generally, they should be at the same calorie level as whatever you were doing, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be hypo, hyper, or iso at any given time. If you were on a cutting phase, generally you will use the same calories that you were just using for that whole meso. Likewise with massing or maintenance phase. The reason why you want to do that is because part of the benefit of the deload is not only alleviating physical fatigue from hard training, but also substrate level fatigue. So even in the example that comes up more often than not, I think for most people, is when they're cutting, right? And then they do their deload, and the logical thought is, well, I'm doing so much less training, my volume has been reduced by, up like 50%. Shouldn't I be eating less? And that's a very good thought, and you certainly can do that. However, you really start to miss out on a complete holistic effect of the deload. So part of the deload is actually not only healing like the psychological and physical damage of that hard training, but also allowing you to repump substrate back into your muscles, right? So actually just making sure your glycogen levels kind of are not full, but getting fuller than where they were plays a huge, huge, huge role in recovery and your ability to perform really hard workouts in the subsequent cycle. So although you might be on a cut diet, you might be hypocaloric, you hit your deload and you think, oh, I got to adjust calories accordingly. What I would say is just maintain whatever you were doing before. So maintain that same calories that you were in, same macros that you were using before. Your workload obviously has gone down. So that means you will be expending less energy. So temporarily during that deload week, you might find yourself in an iso or possibly even a hypercaloric state using those previous calories and macros. However, that's perfectly okay. And actually, I would recommend keeping it that way because now you actually can get a slight substrate level benefit in terms of recovery. So remember, the deload is there for you to recover. I think too many people try to keep doing crazy things, keep trying to make the deload hard. The idea of the deload is recovery, right? So that's physical, psychological, and nutritional, right? So we want to make sure that we're putting substrate and particularly carbohydrate back into the system. So like I said before, if you're whatever you're doing, just maintain that same basic diet approach. If you're on like the end of mass, right, maybe you've been massing up for 3 months or so, and you're on your last deload and you want to tone it back a little bit, that's totally fine. All I would say is don't actively like constrict yourself during the deload. If you want to go down, like if you were doing massing and you want to switch to maintenance, that's fine. You won't hurt yourself unless you're dropping into constricting, like going hypo. First burp, got it out of the way. So generally just keep doing whatever you were doing, right? And like I said, during mass, if you are at the peak of mass and you're ready to move on to maintenance, not a huge deal as long as you're not actively constricting yourself, because that will constrict how much you actually recover. Okay, hopefully I got you, Steve. I know you had some more questions here. So Steve asked another one. On one of the older webinars, it was mentioned that resting too long between sets was counterproductive, as the muscles essentially thought the workout was over and kicked off recovery processes, etc. Would this affect exercise grouping within a workout for the same body part? For example, if I was down to do high bar squats and leg press for quads, would sandwiching something unrelated like benching in between be less optimal than going straight from squats to leg press. I've always split things up this way and find I can lift more in the second exercise with the break, although it is more time consuming since I need to warm up a bit again. Yeah, so this is a really good question. So the problem with that strategy is what you already described, right? Where you warm up one muscle group. So for example, if you're warming up your squats, you do your squat workout, and then if you move on to leg press, it's a really easy transition, right? It only takes you take however much time you want to recover, like 2 to 5 minutes, and then you go onto the leg press, and you don't have to do a ton of warm-up sets on the leg press because you're basically already good to go. You could probably get it within like 1 or 2 warm-up sets, and then you can start training right away. The problem is if you switch to something else unrelated, like a bench press, then you have to do the full cycle of warm-up for bench press, then go into your overload sets for that. And by the time you're done with that, the muscles that you had previously trained might have started to go into that cool down effect already, right? And then you will have to kind of start re-warming up again for the leg press. Now, that's not to say that that is a bad strategy. We can actually kind of weigh some of the pros and cons. So we already said one of the cons is that it's a little bit more time consuming because you kind of have to spend more time re-warming up, right? One of the pros is that you can generally maintain the intensity of some of those latter subsequent exercises, which is actually a really nice pro. So what I would say is, for strength stuff, if you're doing like really, really hard strength training, maximal strength training, or even just, basic strength, like 4 to 8 kind of reps stuff, that might be an advantageous approach so that you can maintain the intensity, since the intensity is a more critical component for the strength training portion. For physique training, if you're just trying to look good naked, lose weight, maintain or gain muscle mass, I would say the downfall of that is that you lose some of the metabolite effects of sequencing agonist muscles together, right? So doing quads back to back until you're basically done with quads. One of the benefits you get from that is just the consistent accumulation of metabolites. Whereas if you switch to something else, you will start to see that, just normal recovery processes, the blood will start washing away some of those things, and then you'll start to cool down. So I would say you're losing out a little bit on metabolite accumulation, maybe gaining a little bit on the intensity of exercise. So maybe during a strength phase, that might be a good time to consider that as an option. If you're doing hypertrophy stuff, like cutting, massing, any of that stuff, I would say probably clump them together would be, I don't want to say a better strategy, but I would say a slightly more advantageous strategy. And we're talking about, fractions of a % in terms of effect size. So by no means is one going to be clearly better than the other, but it's more of a theoretical consideration. So I would say, clump them together for physique training so you can benefit from the metabolite accumulation. And then if you want to split them up and really maintain the intensity of the exercise, probably really good for a strength phase. So another good question, Steve. All right, I think he had one more for me here. And again, this is on the forum. If you guys are just hopping in, I'm starting off with some forum questions. So if you hop in the forum and look on the last page of the James and Mike thread, that's where I'm looking. So Steve asked another one. I've been doing a full body every other day routine for a while now. I'm enjoying the structure and it fits well with my schedule, but I'd like to start making an effort to auto-regulate my volume. Would a good starting point be to begin each body part at the MEV recommendations on the main page, then adjust the number of sets for a given session based on my performance in the subsequent session in the previous week? So week 2 session A would be adjusted based on the performance of the muscle group in week 1 session B. So he's basically asking, can the different sessions affect how you auto-regulate separate sessions, right? And so then he's asking, is this too much micromanaging? I'm hoping this would be led in my routine to naturally evolving into something best suited to whatever movements I choose, etc. So absolutely. So what you do in like a PEC session 1 can absolutely influence PEC session 2 and how you auto-regulate that. Now, what I would say is this can become overly complicated at times, and it can be like you brought up the issue of micromanaging, and so I think it can go there is if you take it to that nth degree. So one of those paralysis by analysis things. So the short answer is yes, just don't go crazy, right? I think when you do your own auto-regulation, part of it is trying to stay really, really objective, and that's something that, and myself and plenty of other clients, we struggle with sometimes, because when you're doing it for yourself, there's always excuses, right? There's every other thing like, oh, I'm going to kickboxing tonight, or oh, I have this reason to not do more sets, or this and that, right? So just be careful on how you do that. It can be really easy to overanalyze and micromanage, just like you said, but absolutely, right? So you can imagine if you're training quads twice a week, even if one of them is a lighter session, you better believe that that one session is going to have a particular, excuse me, having a mouth fart today. The first session or the second session is absolutely going to influence the performance in the latter one. So if you start to notice your performance declining when you reach the next session for that muscle group, you might want to reevaluate the first one and maybe tone it back just a little bit. You might be pushing it too hard, maybe condensing too much of your weekly volume into one of those sessions. It might help to either reduce it, that first session or maybe spread it out just a little bit. So totally fine. I think that's an absolutely good way of micromanaging, and that's actually how some of the men's and women's physique templates are kind of set up. So it's totally fine. Just don't get too caught up in the numbers. Don't get into that paralysis by analysis. You know what I mean? So train hard, have a pretty good idea of your weekly MRVs for all of your major muscle groups. And then if you need to auto-regulate and adjust a little bit here or there, totally fine. Just be objective and don't get caught up in that, like, oh, I had a bad day, so I'm going to tone it down or this and that. You know what I mean? So no big deal. All right, Steve. Plenty of good questions. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on. Stephen Morrissey asked, what are the big differences between men and women that results in the female more mouth farts, geez. Men and women that results in the female physique templates having 3 mesocycles before a resensitization phase, while the men's physique templates has 2 phases before a resensitization phase. So there's not really a super concrete reason. Well, there are reasons behind this, but it's not something that you can go up and look in a textbook that says, you know, here's why. But here's kind of the quicker version. So when we look at populations of males and females, right, males tend to be more muscular and stronger than females, even when matched for lean body mass. So they tend to be stronger even with the same lean body mass. Whereas females tend to be less muscular, less strong, but they also tend to be more fatigue resistant in a number of different ways. And this can be seen in their fiber typing. It can be seen in things like mitochondrial density, enzyme activities, capillarization, vascularization of the tissue. So what we find is that although, and this of course is on average, so I say this and I know somebody's going to be like, well, I know a chick who's 180 and 15% body fat. Yeah, of course, that happens. That's part of the population, but we're just saying on average, females tend to be not as muscular and not as strong as males. That's normal. They do tend to be more fatigue resistant. So what that means is generally female athletes can sustain higher volumes of training than men can. They also tend to recover and bounce back faster. So what we see is for the physique mesocycle of the female versus the male will tend to accumulate fatigue at a more rapid rate. And that fatigue, again, can become chronic and must be alleviated accordingly. So when we have the male physique templates, we only have 2 major mesocycles. Why? Because we expect the fatigue generated from the men to be particularly high, and it needs to have a more wave-like pattern in terms of overload, and then recovery periods. Whereas the females, they tend to bounce back really easily because of some of their physiological differences between men and women. And if you've ever worked with female athletes before, I think a lot of people understand this intuitively, where you give them programs for that would be comparable for something like you or like a peer would do, and they like breeze through it in 30 minutes, and you're like, what the hell? What do you mean you're done, right? Well, the problem is that a lot of times they're not able to disrupt homeostasis to the same degree that men are, simply because they're not as strong or not as muscled. So generally they need much bigger volumes than, and they can tolerate much bigger volumes than men can. So, you know, I've worked with women's rugby, and there have been times where I wrote programs that were like 10 by 10, and the girls would just cruise through them. Not to say that they were dogging it or not working out at appropriate intensities. They could just handle it. Why? Because they weren't super strong and they were really resistant to fatigue. So same idea here, now just blown out on a slightly longer scale. Women tend to bounce back and recover a little bit more efficiently than men do, simply because they're not having the same degree of disruption and can hang on and train longer throughout the year, which is actually it's actually advantageous when you think about it, because with the male physique templates, right, you end up spending a lot more time kind of in that recovery time, which not to say that the resensitization can't be productive. It absolutely can be productive, especially for potentiating long-term strength gains, but it's more time not spent getting more muscular, right? Whereas the female physique templates, they actually spend on average more time either gaining or retaining muscle than the men's physique templates do. And it's simply because they can tolerate it longer. Physiologically, they're just able to hang in there longer than we can. And that's just an advantage that they have, right? So there's some trade-offs there, but nothing too crazy. Okay, thank you for your question. Daniel Jolly had some questions. He's one of our regulars. Okay, first one. Mine is quite an open question, I think. What are your general thoughts about programming for when you have 2 consecutive movements for the same muscle group in a hypertrophy block? Well, I think we just touched on that one a little bit, didn't we? So general thoughts about programming for when you have 2 consecutive movements for the same muscle group in a hypertrophy block. Generally, you're going to pick with the most complicated, meaning the highest degree of technique, and generally the biggest muscle mass exercises first, right? So for example, you wouldn't pick, generally, and that's not to say always, but in general, you wouldn't start with leg press and then move into squats, although you might see people doing that from time to time. So physique, you have some wiggle room with how you structure the exercise order. If you're working with like more, I don't want to say more traditional athletes, but athletes where strength and power and speed characteristics can become important, we follow a much more rigid hierarchy in terms of exercise order. With physique, we still use those same guidelines, but they have a little bit more wiggle room to play around with. So just in this example, if you were planning to train your quads, right, I think a poor strategy in general, not always, in general, would be to start with like leg presses and knee extensions before starting with the squatting type movements. Why? Because the squat's way more technical, has a ton more muscle mass involvement. So you want to pick those harder exercises first and kind of work your way down in kind of decreasing order of complexity and muscle mass. Now, again, there is some wiggle room in there if you want to throw some isolations into the mix. Not a big deal. In terms of other things, usually I try not to go 2 to more than 3 direct movements in a row without maybe peppering in something else. And that could also include a light session of an antagonist muscle or just another synergistic muscle. So for example, with something like a chest day, right, you might do some bench, you might do some down sets on bench, right, and then you might do some flies, whether they're dumbbell or cable flies. And then it might be a good idea to move on to something else like a shoulder press or a lateral raise or tricep, bicep movements, or depending on how many days you have split in your program, maybe you can do a light scapular retractor day, like some light dumbbell rows or something like that. And then if you want to hit some more of that chest stuff at the end, that will be fine. That's not to say that's how you have to do it, but it's a good way of doing it because sometimes if you really plow through some of those hypertrophy workouts, you can accumulate a lot of fatigue really fast. And then when you get to the bottom of your exercises, you just totally crapped out, right? And then once you get crapped out, then it's harder to do anything else. So what I usually suggest is doing kind of like 2 to 3, and that can include like one exercise with 2 workloads, so like 2 to 3 movements, and then maybe move on to some other movements that you're going to do through that session. And then if you want to come back, that's totally fine. What I wouldn't do is kind of alternating back and forth between the main focus, like the chest or the quad, and then bouncing back and forth with other things and coming back to it. That's probably not a good strategy for hypertrophy, might be an okay strategy for strength. So for hypertrophy, we're going to take those same ideas and say, you know, we're probably going to sequence 2 to 3 of those together. And what I usually like to do is pick one movement and then do multiple workloads of that movement. So a lot of people are quick to jump to new exercises, I think too much, where they'll have a chest day and instead of just doing lots of bench or lots of presses, they'll do like, okay, 3 sets of bench here, then I'm going to go 3 sets of incline dumbbell bench, and then I'm going to do 3 sets of machine press, and then 3 sets of flies, and then 3 sets of something else. That's probably not a good strategy because you are using too much variation and you will not be able to benefit from some of those exercise variants later on. What might be a better strategy is to do a crap load of bench and then actually take the weight down a little bit so that you can keep going on bench, right? So for example, you might do like 4 by 10 in the bench, and you know, like after 4 sets, you really won't be able to maintain reps of 10 anymore. You can drop the intensity by like 10 to 15%. So just do some down sets, and then you can crank out like 4 more sets of bench press. That's a great way of doing it. Same thing applies to like back movements, squatting movements, any of those things. So usually for hypertrophy, we'll tend to kind of block out a really good starting movement and then do 2 workloads on that, which I think is a very, very productive strategy. Then if you want to add another variant in there, that's totally fine. It could be a compound or an isolation variant. After you've done that, it might be good to move on to some other things, like if you're doing tris, bis, back, shoulders, whatever, before maybe pounding some more stuff at the end. Hopefully I answered your question. If not, feel free to chime back in and get a clarification. Okay, moving on to the next question from Daniel. I guess more specifically as a second part of the question, I asked because in my upcoming chest back men's physique templates, I have 2 consecutive quad movements on a leg day and was wondering about how to optimize this here. I've been doing high bar squats for the last 4 mesocycles straight, and as much as I've fallen in love with them, I think I should probably give them a break for a mesocycle. And P.S. I think my quads are sensitive enough to work that I can quite easily get into hypertrophically effective volumes, ranges, Yeah, so what I would say is you generally don't want to be blasting the same exercise variant. I mean, but by variant, I mean the explicit exact same variation for probably more than 2, upwards of 3 at the most. I really wouldn't go beyond 3. And I would actually, if I was writing your program, I would probably cap it around 2 mesocycles in a row, preferably just 1. Again, we run into a problem of fatigue management, phase potentiation, and variation. So what we end up seeing is if you just do the same movement, in this case, he gave the example of high bar squats, right? You can keep training that for a while, but unfortunately, there's not enough variation to actually kind of break some of the plateauing effect, the staleness effect. So just a little bit of variation here goes a long way, right? And I think sometimes we get too caught up in the really basic squat variations where we say, okay, well, I only have front squat, high bar squat, low bar squat, but there's actually a shitload of squat variations when you think about it, right? You can do close stance squats, you can do mid stance sumo squats, you can do all sorts of stance variations between high bar and low bar. You can do feet forward, you can do them on a Smith machine, you can do Katsu style, you can do slow eccentrics, you can do pause squats. I mean, any number of stances. Now there's cambered bars, safety bars, like there's any number of bars and stances and intensification techniques that you can use. So it really is at a disadvantage for you to use the same one all the time. So what I would say is pick another one, right? There's nothing wrong with doing like 2 workloads of squat, which is what we already talked about a second ago. But then once you switch your next mesocycle, it's probably a good idea to pick another one. So if you started with high bar, move into close stance or move into a feet forward squat. Or if you're doing something like a metabolite phase and you might not be able to, you might not have enough gas in your tank to do 4 sets of like 15 to 20 reps in the squat, then it's actually maybe a good time to incorporate things like leg pressing and stuff like that. That's perfectly okay, right? Usually you still want to have a big compound free weight movement in there, but it's absolutely okay. So when you run the same variation for more than 3 mesocycles, right, you really start losing out. Whereas if you just switch it up a little bit, we're not saying crazy, right? Just switch it up a little bit, use a different stance, use a different bar, something like that. You kind of help break that staleness, break the plateauing effect, and you can continue training the same general muscle while giving some of the muscle fibers that took the biggest beating a little bit of a break, and then emphasizing slight different regions within that same muscle group, right? So we know that high bar squats are going to activate certain parts of the quadriceps muscle really, really well, and probably a pretty gross body of a pretty large portion of the general quadriceps area. If we switch it up to like a mid-stance sumo or a front squat, we're still going to be training quite a bit of the quads, but in a slightly different way. And we can give some of the motor units that took a beating from that last mesocycle a little bit of a break and emphasize different parts within that same muscle group. So I would say probably don't want to do more than 2 if it was me, 3 at the max. And that would be an example of going like transitioning, doing 2 phases of hypertrophy and then doing a third one of strength. Just to see how much stronger you got on that movement. But even then, I would say you would benefit probably a lot from just changing it up a little bit in there. Variation doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be like total 180, right? We're saying just change your stance a little bit, change the bar, change height, change the position. Just a little something goes a long way. Hopefully I got you on that one. Please let me know if I did not. And then the last part of Daniel's question here, my thinking was that I would start the first week with 1 heavy set of low bar squats in the 4 to 5 rep range. Give me opportunity to feel out the heaviest weight I ever have on my back. I like to feel like I need some time in my low bar squat position. And then 5 sets of hack squats, changing the number 3 to 3, and then have more quad movements later in the week. I figure I do hack squats there too. I would reserve the low bar squats. this is going to probably like open up a can of worms here. Low bar squats is not something I like to program a whole lot. And the reason is because of what you just described. What I find for myself and what I've seen with a lot of clients is that low bar, because it's awkward and it's just enough of a change from high bar and like close stance, it takes like a whole mesocycle to kind of get into a good groove. So really, if you're committing to low bar squats, you're really having to commit to 2 mesocycles of low bar squats. And then if you've heard Mike and I talk about low bar squats before, we generally only recommend you doing them during a strength phase, right? So kind of my approach with the low bar squatting is virtually never used in a hypertrophy cycle because the trade-offs are just unfavorable. They can be used in a strength cycle. So what might be good to do is do a basic strength cycle of low bar squats where you're doing like 4 to 8 reps, so like 5 or 6 reps, and then potentiate that into another maximal strength or like peaking style mesocycle where you break into the 1s and 3s. And after you did the first mesocycle of low bar squats, you should feel really, really good and really comfortable as you get into the second mesocycle. And then you can really start to express the strength in that low bar squatting movement, which it just, in my experience, and hopefully you guys have felt the same way, one mesocycle is not enough to really express that strength in that position. It usually takes at least 2. So I would just take those out unless you're doing kind of the resensitization phase or the strength phase. And if you want to use hack squats, that's okay. Generally, if you're doing the strength, to me, that's kind of a mismatch where you have low bar squats and hack squats. Hack squats are a great supplement for hypertrophy training because they really, really mess up your quads, but they won't be, it's not a great exercise for you to really express maximal forces, right? So it's kind of a mismatch here where I would save the hack squats for when you're doing your hypertrophy stuff, and then I would save the low bar style squatting and things like that when you're in the resensitization and strength phases. And you can supplement other quad movements like paused high bar squats or some front squats or something like that. That would be my approach on that. And let me know what you think. You can comment on the thread. I'll get back to you. Okay, so I'm going to close these out for now because I think I got all of my preemptive questions. I'm going to get to some of the ones posted on the live feed. I'm just going to refresh it because sometimes it doesn't always show up right away. So I'm going to refresh. Okay. Got a question from Ajmain Chowdhury. Hopefully I said that right. Hey, Dr. James, I'm taking an XPhys course in the fall at my university. And after looking at the textbook for the course, I've seen that the nutrition section is pretty outdated and seems like it could be misleading to anyone who doesn't have any previous knowledge in nutrition. Can you recommend any books to supplement the nutritional aspect? Yeah, man, there's tons of good sport nutrition books. The generally, obviously, like it's hard to not make a shameless RP plug here, right? So obviously our book is probably really good and it doesn't cost as much as a textbook. And I think it's arguably probably better than a lot of them. Shameless plug aside, the textbooks that I generally recommend are Eugendrup, Sport Nutrition, and that starts with a J, and it's Eugendrup and Gleason. Sport Nutrition is the name. That is a really, really great, and it's a hard science textbook though. So a lot of people, we recommend that book and they go, oh, this is all like biochemistry. Well, nutrition's all biochemistry, homie. Like that's what this is. So it's not the easiest read in the world, but it is very thorough, very in-depth, and they use tons and tons of base science and field science to get their points across. So I really, really like that book. That's what I used for my nutrient metabolism class when I was teaching at Temple U. Another one is Bernadotte, Advanced Sport Nutrition. Another one, it's definitely on the dry side, but also really, really useful, really, really good. One book that I usually recommend, and this might sound kind of silly, is actually John Ivey's book on sport nutrition. It's actually called Nutrient Timing, The Future of Sport Nutrition. It was released in like the 2000s. It's a really, really short book. Unfortunately, the emphasis of the book is nutrient timing, which we have found to not be as powerful as we had hoped. However, it's a great book. It only costs like $15. I think you can get it on Amazon Prime. So if you order it today, it'll show up tomorrow. And it gives a really, really fantastic quick overview of sport nutrition. So we know that the nutrient timing stuff didn't pan out to be quite as powerful as we had hoped. The effect sizes just simply weren't that large. But the basic information in that book is fantastic. So I really like, actually, I recommend that to all my students and everyone who just want a quick, like, here's what you need to know about sport nutrition. The foundational information in there is good. Just take some of the crazy nutrient timing stuff with a grain of salt, knowing that it's maybe not as powerful as we once thought. Cool. It looks like Ajman a little bit early. So I think that's all the questions that I have up to date, unless you guys want to start throwing some more on there. Please feel free, especially if I was not clear on any of the points that I already made. So I already ran through all the questions that were on the forum, and I'm going to refresh again and see if there's any new questions that have populated, but it doesn't look like there have been. Okay, so no new questions. I did want to maybe give you guys a quick recovery training tip that I have kind of come across and played around with a little bit. So no big surprise. People love to listen to music while they train. Hopefully you guys all can relate to that, right? Absolutely. One of the things that I have been messing around with and have found success, and I encourage you guys to think about, is not listening to music that gets you really, really amped up, like gives you like an emotional response when you are not training. So one of the problems that you can run into is kind of a desensitization of a stress response, which is a normal effect. When you kind of get the same stimulus over and over and over again, it becomes less and less stressful, right? No brainer there. But one of the things that I've been messing around with is actually deliberately not listening to music, which unfortunately means not listening to music that I really, really like, but actually reserving that music for times when I know I'm going to be training really, really hard. And so there have been like albums and things that I have not listened to for going on years now. And I actually did this experiment on myself this week. And I picked an album that I hadn't listened to that I really, really loved. And I know it gives me like a very strong emotional response, not just like a death metal angry response, but, you know, one that like really gets me like amped up. And for a very long time, and I went and trained. And you know that feeling when you hear a song that you know, like, oh, it just gets you so amped, but you hadn't heard it in a long time. I nearly like shat a brick when it came on, and I had a great training session. And so one of the things that I've been kind of doing with myself, and I would encourage you guys to do, is kind of have music that you can listen to when you're just doing your daily business, right? If you're going to work or going to school or you're just chilling out, right? Have music that you enjoy and can relax and just chill out with, and then have that pump up music, whatever it is, right? So sometimes people think like pump up music has to be like death metal, angry music, right? Pump up music can be whatever it is for you. And so mine is a variety of things, but anything that you know is going to elicit like an emotional response or give you those goosebumps, save that and don't use it all the time. And then what I would actually recommend you think about doing is cycling some of those things, and don't reuse them all the time. Maybe pick a couple albums that you really like, save them for a month, and then actually kind of recycle them through and pick some other stuff throughout time. One thing that you find is that if you listen to the same like playlist, the same stuff all the time, it gets boring, right? You get burnt out on it. You're like, ah, now I hate this song, right? It's actually probably a good idea to not listen to that pump up music when you're not needing to get pumped up, and then kind of cycle some of those through so they have that pump up effect, which is something that I've been playing around with. And I know it sounds kind of silly and maybe kind of dumb, but it's something that I have used with great effect. So when you actually hear some of those songs and that music that you really, really like and really gets you amped up, really, really get a crazy stress response, which during training is good. And then you have to obviously relax and calm back down. But I actually really like doing that. So something to think about. All right. People have chimed in here. It looks like Danny chimed in. To ask what it's like being so much cooler than Dr. Mike. Feel free to fill him in. Oh, Dr. Mike, he couldn't be here today, Mr. Fancy Pants. No, actually, I just volunteered to help out because Nick was tied up with something. Yeah, Mike's got a lot of crazy stuff going on, doesn't he? He was just all over. He was all over Europe. We went to Australia not that long ago. He's been doing Juggernaut stuff. Oh man, all over the place. Okay. Ajman came back, got back in time for my question. Thanks so much. I'm taking this course alongside Biochem and Cell Bio, so it'll be awesome to see the parallels in the coursework. Also, I go by, AJ, cool, right on. So AJ, sounds good. Cell Bio and Biochem will be really, really good supplements to those books. Biochem, I was actually a Biochem major as an undergrad, and so Biochem is kind of like the anatomy and physiology of the bio and chem classes where it's a lot of memorization, like, okay, here's this amino acid, here's this carbohydrate, here's this lipid, know how to draw it, know how it looks. So it's not the hardest class in the world, but it is a lot of work. Cell bio is really, really fun. If you have a good grasp on cell bio, you'll have a really, really good understanding of EuChemDrill. Okay, Danny commented on what I was just ranting about here. So Danny said, I found that periodizing my music with phases works pretty well too. Calmer music for easier microcycles and pump up music for the end of my mesocycles. Also, this is, this is Danny, a former student of mine who graduated, and he did excellent, and I hope he's doing well as well. So yeah, Danny basically is saying the same thing, kind of this idea of periodizing your music to maintain kind of a stress response to it, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But I think it's really cool and really important because how many times have you tried to get like really, really pumped up for a squat and you put your tunes on and you just fell flat and you're just like same old shit, different day, right? That happens. So one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is just not listening to your pump up music at rest when you're at home or when you're doing like schoolwork or when you're riding the bus or train or anything. And then kind of pulling it out of the hat when you really, really need to work on hitting a big number, hitting a big lift. And that's something that I have used with a lot of success so far. And I think it's important, right? So just like we say, like you need to relax to maintain your stress response, you don't want to actually elicit the stress response using the same things all the time. So how you get yourself pumped up for training might vary depending on what you're doing. All right, well, it doesn't look like we have a ton more questions. I'm just going to hang out for a few more minutes here if people have more questions that they want to pop in. If not, no big deal. I know you already got your dose of Mike and I this week, so I'll hang on for a few more minutes. I'm just going to refresh and see if any more questions pop up. If anybody needs a clarification on any of the points that I made earlier, please feel free to jump in there and say, hey, James, I didn't understand what you're saying. Can you get back to it? Totally fine. I will not take it personally. Here. Let's see, anything new? Nothing new. That's okay. We'll give it a few minutes, and if not, maybe we'll wrap up a little bit earlier this time. No big deal. No need to stretch it out if all questions have been answered, which is a good problem to have, hopefully. Hopefully you guys aren't just like, oh, this guy sucks and tuning out. Okay. Well, so far so good. Looks like all questions have been answered. Give it like here, and then I'll probably just tune out for the rest of the day since nothing news posting here. All right, folks. Well, hopefully we got some good Q&A done today. I like to try and make sure we get all of your forum posts done as much as I can. I know sometimes can't always get on the forum as frequently as I'd like to, but if I can try to make sure that we get to your questions one way, shape, or form as best as I can. So I try to pull them from the forum and at least hit them on the Q&A. So hopefully you guys get to watch the Q&As and all your questions get answered one way, shape, or form. All right, well, nothing news popped up. So, I'm probably going to sign off for today. Thanks, RP Plus, for tuning in. I know a lot of you guys may not tune in live, but you watch the replays. That's awesome too. So if you're watching the replay and you're like, man, I wish you would have said something to clarify this, or I wish you would have talked about this other aspect that we missed, please, please, please post it up in the miscellaneous Ask Dr. Mike and James forum on RP Plus, and I will do my damnedest to make sure that it makes its way onto the weekly webinar one way, shape, or form. All right, RP Plus, I'm going to peace out for now. I hope you guys are having a great week, and I hope you have a great 4th of July weekend. One real quick thing, seeing as that normally our weekly webinar is on Tuesday, and the 4th of July is on Tuesday coming up, we're going to do the normal weekly webinar on Wednesday. So we know that nobody's going to be tuning in on the 4th. You guys are all going to be out barbecuing, having fun, cheating on your diets, watching fireworks, all that stuff. And that's totally cool. We'll do our normal weekly webinar on Wednesday this upcoming week. So don't panic. We're going to do it on Wednesday, and I believe we'll send out an email on RP Plus. So you'll be in the loop either way. All right, guys. I'm going to tune out for now. Hope you guys have a great rest of the week and a great 4th of July weekend if I don't get to see you or talk to you. Signing out for now. Have a great week.